And I'm very pleased to welcome to the programme now the Israeli journalist Gideon Levy, who writes a column for the Haaretz newspaper. He joins us live now from Tel Aviv. Good afternoon to you, sir. Thank you for talking to us.
Thank you for having me.
How would you today assess the public mood in Israel 5 months into this war? Is there growing concern now about the kinds of images we saw in that report, the death toll in Gaza, the lack of food in Gaza?
Definitely not. First of all, most of those images are not shown in Israel. They are shown all over the world except of one place, Israel, 1 hour away from my office. These scenes are taking place and you will see very little of it in the Israeli TV and most of the Israeli newspapers. Secondly, the Israelis, most of them, not all of them obviously, decided on the 7th of October that after what the Palestinians had done to us, we have now the right to do whatever we want. There are no limits, no pity, no mercy, no empathy with Gaza. Worse than this, expressing any kind of empathy with the sufferer of Gaza is almost criminalized in Israel. It's a betrayal. You shouldn't feel anything toward Gaza because Gaza attacked us on the 7th of October. This obviously is a very, very sick way of thinking.
You, though, for a long time have called out Israeli actions, including in this war, including in Gaza, while, of course, not diminishing the crimes that Hamas did on October the 7th. I'm interested now, as the war enters its 6th month, do you feel yourself like you're a lone voice in Israeli public discourse with the message that you have? Or do you have a sense that more people are starting to listen? Because it does seem, for one thing, there are Israelis out in the streets who are calling for a ceasefire.
There are Israelis who are calling for a ceasefire in the streets in order to release the hostages, not in order to stop the suffer of Gaza. There are Israelis who call to get to a ceasefire, but not to stop the war. Those are very few in Israel, fewer than ever, fewer than in any former military action of Israel, because we had many brutal wars. This one is the most brutal war, and this one lacks any kind of opposition or resistance within Israel.
Can we talk a bit about the news today? Hamas has left now Cairo, we understand. So it appears that truce talks that many people were hopeful would be secured aren't going to happen anytime soon. Now, the Israeli government has blamed Hamas directly. It says Hamas isn't providing information about the hostages in Gaza. But do you think right now the Israeli government is actually interested in a ceasefire in Gaza? Because, for one thing, they didn't send delegates to those talks in Cairo.
They didn't send, the Hamas left, and both sides don't seem to be very enthusiastic about the truth. And this is very worrying. Israel, for its own reason, it's not Israel, it's the Israeli government, for its own domestic political reasons, is not, I don't want to say they don't want to see the hostages getting released, they don't want to see some kind of agreement, but it doesn't burn in their bones. And for Hamas, Hamas sees that time is just doing good to the power of Hamas in terms of political support in the Arab world and elsewhere.
I want to talk about the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, but just before we move on to that, you talked about the fact that there are Israelis out in the streets who are calling for a ceasefire, but that is to release those hostages held in Gaza. In exchange for that, we know that Palestinian prisoners will almost certainly need to be freed from Israeli jails. Is there public acceptance in Israel that will need to be part of this deal?
It depends how many, depends who, and it depends in which circles in Israel. In this, Israel differs. Obviously, the camp of the liberals, of the leftists or so-called leftists, and obviously the families of the hostages, they all push for any kind of price to be paid for releasing the hostages. But the right-wingers are very tough in their resistance to this. They think Israel shouldn't do it. And in this way, Israel is quite different.
Can I ask you about Netanyahu directly then? How would you assess his strategy now? I don't mean by that his military strategy in Gaza, but politically, because there are those out there who say, look, Netanyahu doesn't want the war in Gaza to end because when it does, he will have huge questions to answer, and it could spell the end of his long political career as Israel's leader. Is that a view, an analysis that you share?
It's the view which is shared by most of his critics, by most of the analysts. They think that he's just pulling time now in order to prolong the war as much as possible. I would give him a little bit more credit than this. I don't think that's his only consideration. I'm sure it is one of his considerations. I'm not sure it's the only one. Don't forget that he's also being exposed to heavy pressure by the partners, his partners to the coalition, who are even more right-wing than him, more racist and more nationalistic than him. And he's quite captured by them. And he let it go. I mean, he could have gone for a deal long time ago. He doesn't do it, and that's a matter of fact. There is no doubt that he doesn't push enough to bring the hostages home, but the motivations are different. There may be more than one motivation for this.
What about political opposition to Netanyahu? We saw Benny Gantz was in Washington earlier on this week. Is he a credible alternative to Netanyahu?
He's a very credible alternative, but he's not really an alternative when it comes to the basic issues like continuing the occupation or continuing the war. In those basic questions, there is much less difference between the two than it seems from the outside. They are different in their manners, they are different in their level of corruption, they are different in their motivations. But by the end of the day, when it will come to really the core issues which define Israel, don't expect too much from the alternative.
And just a final question. In the beginning of February, Joe Biden approved sanctions on a small group of Israeli settlers in the West Bank. That was a rare step by Washington. What kind of reaction did that get in Israel? And do you personally support those kinds of sanctions?
I support them, but that's really quite a joke. It's too little, it's too late. We are dealing with 4 individuals who in any case have no business in the United States, and there's no leverage on them. You know, I'm quite sick and tired from all those lip services. If you want to put pressure on Israel, on the settlers, on whatever, the United States knows very well how to do it, and so does the EU, by the way. And this is by actions, not by talkings and not by symbolic steps like putting some sanctions on 4 individuals out of 10 million Israelis. It's really ridiculous.
Gideon Levy, there's so much more I'd like to ask you, but we'll have to leave it there. Thank you, sir, very much indeed for your time today.
Thank you for having me.